Well, welcome to the Nicholas Mee Company annual review. This year we're making it something slightly different. You'll notice there's just Nick and myself, and there's a good reason for that, because next year will be 30 years. It'll be the 30th anniversary of the company. Nick and I have known each other for a fair chunk of that, so we thought this time might be a good idea to look back at what Nick's done and what they're doing here at Essendonbury. Next year, rest assured, we'll be back as a full panel, looking ahead and looking behind us and seeing where we are. But it's a great pleasure of mine to introduce Nick, who is the man behind at the helm, if you like. And what I'd like to do is to talk to you, Nick, a little bit about how you started off in the business. What were things like? I mean, did you come from a car family?
Yes, indeed I did actually. Although I just wanted to say right from the beginning, when the concept of doing this came up, I did have a moment of thinking, oh God, I'm not sure about all this, because actually trying to remember events and things that happened over the course of 30 years, not easy, and it does take you into a bit of a strange place. But anyway, yes, to answer your question, quite remotely, but on my mother's side, my great-grandfather was apprenticed in London as what used to be called a wheelwright and coachmaker. And by a strange coincidence, and it is a coincidence, he moved out of London as a young man and started a business, J. Gray and Sons, in Hatfield, and used to, amongst other activities, repair coaches for Lord Salisbury, who is of course Hatfield House and Hatfield Park and so on. And he grew into motor cars with the advent of the petrol engine car, and became agents for RAC and the AA, and then ultimately he had franchises for Austin and Rover and MG, which existed actually as a business, although not in family ownership, until I think it was the late 70s, early 80s. So yeah, that maybe is where it all comes from in terms of the passion for cars.
And did you go to motor racing or races or anything
What, as
like
a young
that?
lad?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I was born and raised in Leicestershire, and I used to go, or was taken by my parents and friends of the family, to Mallory Park. So yes, I used to see motor racing at Mallory Park, and I think once at Donington, and but that was, formative years before moving to live in London when I was 16. So.
And what was your first job? Because I mean, we know that your first sort of proper motoring job was at HRO, but did you have anything before that, or?
Oh yeah. So I left school at sort of 17, and I had been at a boarding school, which I didn't really enjoy, and I didn't really enjoy school at all, and wasn't particularly good at being at school, and didn't really want to go into further education. So when I left school, I enrolled with a company called Henleys in Hendon, Henleys of Hendon. They were the largest Jaguar agents in the world, actually, at the time, and they provided something that they called a sales training course. Actually, had nothing to do with sales at all. And so for a year, I was a fitter's mate on the workshop under a mechanic, and a particularly loud one. I remember his name, Dino Inzani. And that's where I really learned about motor cars. And then I did some time in service reception and parts, and got a general grounding in how the motor trade works in terms of distribution and sales and service and parts and so on. So that's where it all started, and I went from there to work for a short time at AFN when they were in Isleworth at the old Falcon Works, under a guy called, I can't remember, Gregory, assisting, so-called management assistant in the body shop. It was quite interesting, learned a bit about Porsches over that time, and then did a short time at Charles Follett's, who were principally Jensen people at the time in St John's Wood, before I spent 18 months in the United States, living the life and growing up, I think is probably the way to put it. And then after the States, coming back in 74, 75, I did take a job as a junior salesman at HRO in Melton Court, South Kensington, a showroom that's still there actually. It's Lamborghini now.
So what were you selling then? Because I mean the Henleys was Jaguar, so you've always been quite superior cars.
Well,
Porsches,
I don't know whether
Jaguars.
Jaguars were superior cars, but they were certainly popular at the time. And yeah, a luxury car and sports car with an E-Type. But yeah, I suppose I have really. It's just, I don't know how that's happened, but it did happen. And very enjoyable it was too. But at HRO in South Kensington, the franchises at that time that we had for that particular location was Ferrari, Rolls and Bentley, and Jaguar and Rover. So it was a combination of stuff, and I was there for 18 months, rose from junior to being, I don't know, whatever the middle salesman were called at the time, I can't remember. And then ultimately was offered a job which I took with Aston Martin in Sloane Street, as it was then, 33 Sloane Street, in March 76. That's 3 months after the company had come out of receivership, Aston Martin.
And also that was at the time, particularly at Owens, with the oil crisis, and it must have been very difficult selling cars unless people came along with bags of cash, presumably.
Yeah, it was shortly after that, the oil crisis, but it was still very, very difficult. Yeah, I remember quite firmly being on notice before I sold my first car, which was interesting. And that was actually an E-Type in lavender, wonderful colour, to a young Arab fellow actually. And then it just went from there. There was a sort of moment where, I'd sort of conquered all those inhibitions that you have when you're trying to sell someone a motor car, particularly a luxury motor car, and got past that, and suddenly I was getting them done and sold.
And some of the cars must have been, I think they were making cars in the early 70s, they were sort of stored for a couple of years, weren't they? It wasn't just Aston, I think Ferrari did that as well.
Yeah, yeah, I know we all think when we're buying a new car it's brand new, but sometimes it's not really quite new. In fact, when I started at Astons in 76, the cars that we were trying to sell at the time and did accomplish and delivered in 1976, most of them had been on the production line in 1974 when the company had gone out of business. And when Aston closed, all those cars that were in production, they just stayed there and basically gathered dust until the company started again in January 76. The first cars coming off the line then 2-3 months later, and those were the cars that I was selling as new cars. So, well, they were, but they kind of had taken 2 years to build.
And what was the delivery like on a new Aston that wasn't one that had been there for a couple of years? How long did people have to wait for one then? Or once the factory got going, did they then start making them quite quickly?
Well, they've never been made that quickly because each car took 12 weeks to make on average. We started to get a flow of cars, but it was difficult to sell them. And I think you have to put it into context. You're into 1976. The V8 at that stage was no longer a new car, and technology was starting to move apace, and they weren't the new technology cars. Things like fuel injection was a thing that was being introduced quite heavily in German, particularly cars, and so it was an uphill struggle. And made worse by the fact that Aston Martin had been out of business, and people were being asked by people like myself to spend quite a lot of money. We're talking almost Rolls and Bentley money for a motor car that's come out of a manufacturer which had very recently been out of business, and they were concerned. Is Aston Martin going to exist? Good question. No answer. But yeah, it was never easy with the V8. And also, as a car, it had previously in the DBS form acquired a reputation for being less than 100% reliable. So there were lots of uphill struggles in getting that whole thing going. But it was always exciting.
And speaking technology, later on that year, I think it was October, wasn't it, the motor show, was it that year that they launched the Wedge?
Yes,
and
indeed,
that had a big effect on the profile of the company.
And a lot of people don't necessarily understand the importance of Lagonda, but yes, certainly at the time, I think it was a 76, 77 motor show, the Lagonda as a concept was launched, and there was a car on the stand. It didn't work, and it was front page news. I mean, it was front page, I think, on the Telegraph and various other papers as well, and space age to look at. And what it really achieved for Aston Martin, the company, was to say to the world through media that the company was back in business. And as a result of that launch at the motor show, people were ordering cars and paying substantial deposit. In fact, I remember being on the show stand on the launch and sitting at one of those, used to get those little low tables and stools that motor show stands used to have in those days, and talking to someone and writing out the order and asking them to sign it and take a cheque from them, when a fellow tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Excuse me, can I order one too?" So I interpret that as people queuing to order the Lagonda. And of course it was another 3 or 4 years before they were delivered, because it was a troublesome car with all this new technology that was promised in it, touch sensitive switches and liquid crystal displays and so on and so forth on the dashboard. But it was a very interesting launch and a very interesting car, and it did a lot of good for the company in terms of sales, right through a very tricky period, which was 1980, 81, 82 in the UK. There had been changes to the tax system on being able to claw back VAT on lease schemes and so on. And it was the Margaret Thatcher era, I think, at the beginning of. Things were difficult, and it's a matter of fact, if we hadn't had Lagonda and all those export sales to the Middle East and the Far East and the United States, Aston Martin would not have got past 1980.
Fascinating.
So it's a very important car in the history of the company, derided in some quarters. It's a Marmite car, isn't it, really? Some people love it, some people
and
don't.
you must have sold some in some incredible specifications.
Yes.
Televisions?
Yeah. TVs, skirts, curtains.
Yes.
Curtains were always a tricky one because it was the fabric, it had to be stretchy, and the colours and so on. All very, yes, all of that stuff. You had boomerang aerials on boot lids. And
all white inside, white outside.
Yeah, one delivered to the Al Saud family, white and white, boomerang aerial, TVs, all that sort of, I think it was a stretch one actually, with skirts and things painted white. There was, I remember one in a grey with a green interior, and all the external bright work had to be gilded. It attracted a lot of attention wherever it went. In fact, right down to when I got married in 1983, and at the time, Aston Martin had an arrangement. It was a deal, if you like, with employees. Anyone getting married, they got an Aston Martin for the wedding. And they very kindly provided me a Lagonda, and great stuff, thank you very much. But the downside was most of the wedding photographs were of the car and not the bride and groom.
I think we want to see those at some point, Nick. Perhaps next year we'll bring them along.
Maybe, if I can find them.
And what, apart from the Middle East, which is obviously a big market for the cars, who else was it that sort of, landed gentry and captains of industry and advertising execs and people like that buying the cars?
It was a very expensive car, so they were the top of the tree guys buying it, people owning football clubs and so on and so forth. I wouldn't like to say that they were necessarily what you call a traditional Aston Martin
They'd be
owner.
more the V8.
Yeah, they weren't. It wasn't all about having a performance sporting car. It was a status symbol to have a Lagonda, and put it into context in the time that the alternatives for them, people who wanted to spend that sort of money on a motor car, were pretty limited. You know, it was a Silver Shadow or Silver Spirit or a Bentley. Bentleys were kind of on the knees, and they nearly, you know, got rid of the brand at that time. So, you know, and Mercs were to a penny and Jags were to, what else was there? It had its own kind of sphere. It was, okay. You might say it was the first sort of super saloon in a way.
And didn't you, those days, you'd often deal with like hotel porters or chauffeurs and
Definitely.
people like that
Yeah.
who'd say, oh, I think I can find you a client for one of your cars. And
Oh, there were lots of arrangements made with hotel porters. They were very useful in the day. You know, introductions were important because this was a car, certainly from my point of view, I was selling in London, but the majority of the cars did go overseas. So having the contact with the porters from the Carlton Tower and the Park Tower and the Dorchester was very important because they'd send people down and we'd deal with them.
so, I mean, London obviously was the centre of sales for Aston. What could you put a percentage on it? Because they had an operation in America, didn't they? And they sold cars elsewhere, but London must have sold.
Yeah, if you go back to those days, the mix, if you like, was predominantly UK and some export. And things like the Lagonda did change that, as did the introduction of the V8 Volante. And suddenly markets like the United States became more important. And the Far East and so on. But yeah, you know, making 250 cars a year at the time, and I think export sales really accounted for probably no more than 30%. Unlike today, where I think you'll find that the mix is more like 20% UK and the rest is export. But at the time, but what we did in Sloane Street was not just selling new cars and you know, fairly recent used Astons, but we did export sales. This was important. We could actually sell a car to someone from the Middle East. They could buy it without paying local taxes, and it could be registered and used in the UK for up to 12 months. And at that point, they had to export the car or pay duties. So export sales were kind of important too. And London was at the time also quite an Arab influx. It was, you know, the explosion of the Arab culture entering Western society, if you like. It was the
oil
thing.
boom, wasn't it? And
absolutely.
the casinos and hotels.
And
clubs.
the Lagondas were definitely, you know, a car that they had to be seen in.
And then a couple of years later, the Oscar India came out, which is the first new V8 that you had to sell. Did you have some of the old ones still to clear?
Yes, no, we did. Actually, the Oscar India V8 was kind of interesting because it wasn't really entirely new. In fact, there wasn't an awful lot new on the car other than one or two body revisions and woodwork on the inside. It was just luxified, if I can put it to you that way, and brought forward a little bit. But the basics of the car were very much the same as 1977 V8s, which in themselves were slightly improved on the cars that had been built between 1974 and 76. In fact, the V8 all through its life was improved, but at small stages at a time. Yeah, when Oscar India came out, the Motor Show 1978, I think it was, 77, 78.
I think it was. The Vantage came out at the same time.
That's
They
right.
were certainly
Yeah,
testing
yeah,
the Vantage,
yeah.
weren't they?
We actually had a Motor Show stand that looked fantastic that year. All the cars, so the V8 was in Oscar India, the Vantage in Oscar India, the Volante launch, and I think we had a Lagonda too. They were all finished in the same colour scheme, which was, I think, called tourmaline blue, with the fawn interior. And it did look very she, and it was great. And that was a big lift for us because actually it brought the car forward, certainly visually, for a lot of people, and it gave them an excuse to think in terms of changing their 77, 78 from 80, 81, which we did a lot of. But yeah, when that did happen, we did have quite a lot of earlier cars in stock, and yeah, I had a bet actually with my then sales manager, a guy called Tony Nugent, to actually clear them by a certain day. and negotiated a bit of extra commission to get them done. And I kind of got most of them gone, but there were one or two left over, and we managed to get them sold. But yeah, Oscar India was quite a big thing at the time.
But you must have some competition then from a Mercedes 500 SL and Porsche 928, Ferrari 400.
Yeah.
How did you, which were probably cheap, they're still expensive cars, but cheaper than Astons, weren't they? But they were still luxurious and
I wouldn't
possibly
say that,
better built,
I don't think the Ferrari was cheaper. What was the 365, which became the 400.
400, yeah.
400 but things like 928 were definitely a problem because they had a new car which was actually pretty good. I mean, it was very well balanced, great road holding, handling, performance, Porsche build quality, and yes, it was cheaper. So yeah, the competition was hotting up, and it was a problem for Aston to counter that, as really there was never the money there to bring the product as far forward and as quickly as people within the company would have liked. So it was always an uphill battle with people, you know, in like 928s used to have, for instance, there's a new thing, ABS braking, you know, all great. So people would ask about Astons, has it got ABS? And we had to respond with, no, but you know what ABS stands for, don't you? No, what's that? Oh, all bullshit. But, you know, we had what we had, and we had to get on with it. Yeah.
And also around that time, you have new owners with Victor Gauntlett and Sage Industrials. Could you feel with someone like Victor there, a passionate car enthusiast? Presumably you had someone who really knew, he liked buying cars and driving cars.
Yeah.
And fantastic salesman, and amazing personality. It must have been remarkable to work with.
Yeah, so Victor, funny enough, was the client before he got involved in buying into Aston Martin, and a great car guy. I think I sold him 2 or 3 cars, including Ferraris, before he got involved. But what he brought into the business was a great sense of passion for motor cars and impetus, and a management style which was get on with it, just get on with it. What he couldn't bring was the major funds that were going to be needed to bring the car forward to where it should have been. But what he really did, and particularly through the 80s, was instead of having the attitude of what's it costing to build this car and we just need to add a bit on to make some money out of it, of saying, no, we need to position the car as a luxury item, and we need to position its pricing as a luxury item. We need to think in terms of where the car stands in market economics, not where it stands in this is what it costs to build and add a bit. So it was kind of like a new way of thinking that he brought to the business, and it was adopted by all management in the company at the time. And it was a time of quite a lot of excitement, you know, about and push and get on with it, and enthusiasm. It was great. He brought an enthusiasm that hadn't really been there for some years.
And it was a buoyant time for sales as well, wasn't it then?
It did help, yeah. I mean, the 80s were a very interesting period. Having come out, you know, the early years of Thatcher and recessions, we get into the mid-80s, and it was quite interesting. There was quite a high demand, and I think this coincides with the after effects of Big Bang, and suddenly city people, money was out there. It was fashionable to spend money. It was fashionable to be seen to be spending money, and so people wanted Porsches. They wanted big flash Mercedes with AMG bits bolted on. Astons got carried away with this too, and so it became easier. And there's a moment, probably in late 85, 86, where suddenly the sort of power was shifting from having to almost get on your knees to get people to buy an Aston and so on, to actually saying, well, we can probably get you car in Q3 next year, or, you know, a waiting list is a is a marvellous tool. So we started to get waiting lists for motor cars in the later 80s, and it made life a lot easier.
And by then, the company had moved to Cheval Place.
Yes, in 84, at that time, I'd been promoted to managing Aston Martin Sales for Aston Martin. We got notice from the landlords of 33 Sloane Street that the rent was going to be increased by about 120%, I think it was, which felt pretty awkward, just as because it sort of coincided with actually we're starting to get some momentum here. And so the decision was made to let the remaining 10 years of that lease go to whoever wanted to buy, and to move the business. And rather fortunately, at a time when Louis Vuitton, I think it was, were looking for new premises in Sloane Street, we were, or Victor was able to negotiate a very good deal for us to exit, and they could have the last 10 years of the lease. And coincidentally, and it was a coincidence, I received details of a showroom in Cheval Place, which had been a Rolls-Royce showroom, some specialists called Paddon Brothers, Paddon I think it was, which we were able, or there was the ability to buy the freehold of. And so, yeah, we completed that deal and spent quite a lot of money at the proceeds of the relinquishment of the Sloane Street showroom on making a super showroom in Cheval Place. We knew it was going to be off-piste, if you like, tucked away, just off Montpellier Street. And so we made it, you know, really ritzy, lots of travertine flooring, great wall coverings and lighting and so on. So we made a terrific showroom there for what was, I don't know, about 5 or 6 cars upstairs at a squeeze and 7 or 8 downstairs. There was a concern that we wouldn't get the passing trade, but actually it didn't make any difference. Quite interesting.
And was this the time of the V8 Zagato?
It was, yeah, V8 Zagato. In fact, we did launch it in Sloane Street. The launch was an interesting affair, unlike today's launches. We launched it with a scale model. But we made a big thing of it. We blacked out all the windows and had some lighting brought in and caterers and so on, and presented this model of actually it was the Winton model, which had been dressed up in a nice Perspex box, all of that size, to some interested parties, and started taking orders for that. Yeah.
And also that was presumably was it around the time of the waiting lists and the overs, so that people were desperate to get on a list, they could then sell the cars at a profit when they took delivery of them. Yeah,
it was just starting probably at that point. And again, you know, there was still, and it was been there for many, many years, that sort of, I'm not sure about it, is it going to be all right, you know, and then Zagato, what about Zagato? It was a bit of an unknown thing to a number of people, but yeah, it kicked off very well, and as always with these special edition type things at that time, you'd launch it, you'd probably sell a third very quickly to regular clients. Thank you very much, here's the order, here's the check, great. Then you had to work a bit to get the rest done. And then towards the end, you were able to get those sold simply by saying, look, you know, there's 1 left, there's 2 left, there's 3 left. Get in quick before you've missed the boat. And yeah, people who took delivery of those cars, which was really 86, 85, end of 86 onwards, were able within a short period of time, if they wanted to have resold their car and done handsomely out of it. But of course, you never really know that when you're taking a man's order 18 months before he gets the motor car. So yeah, that late 80s period was really interesting from the point of view of people taking profits out of new cars. And
were you selling classic Astons, you know, the DB era Astons of that time as well?
Yeah, not in the same way as today. But yes, through the 80s, you really had the emergence of classic cars as a business, as a movement, if you like. Prior to that, you know, you might have had an Aston Martin and it got to be 10, 15, 20 years old and, you know, it was left to rot away or whatever. It didn't really have a value. As you get into the 80s, you start to get, you know, people forming collections of motor cars. Victor was a great collector of cars. And those people, you know, amassed numbers of cars, and as they rose in value, they were moving them on, you know, and you couldn't blame them for that. But you had, you know, at the beginning of the 80s, say 80, 81, you had one classic car magazine, Thoroughbred and Classic Cars, was it, I think called? And then you had another, and then there was another, and you had classic car auctions, and then you had people making merchandise, and then you had people reproducing parts, and it all grew in the 80s and snowballed with some of it from city money out of Big Bang. Collectors worldwide were suddenly waking up to a classic car as something to have and enjoy. And that's where it all started, really, in any kind of meaningful way.
Because at that time, or prior to that, the typical classic car would be a Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost Brighton Run sort of thing, wouldn't it?
Yeah,
or Duesenberg or something like that. They weren't what we call modern, you know, post-war classics.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And a restoration in those days was a bloke in his garage at the bottom of the garden. It wasn't, there weren't, you know, professional restorers were something you had to really seek out. And of course the standard of restorations has changed immeasurably since those days as well. You know, the classic car movement, industry, call it what you like, really gained momentum and became a force and something of reckoning through the 80s, and took a bit of a hit, as everything did at the back end of 91, or 1990, 91, early 90s, when we had what was actually thought of at the time as the first global recession, as opposed to local recessions.
And there's a Bond film as well with an Aston in it again? Living
There
Daylights.
was, yeah, Living Daylights. That was quite an interesting thing, particularly for Victor, in so much as he'd answered the request from Eon Productions to have an Aston Martin in the next film. I think they'd worked out they needed it. And they'd had meetings with them, and during the meetings they actually offered him the part, or one of the parts of a Russian general, which was quite tempting. But yeah, the V8 Volante in the Living Daylights, which is often misdescribed out there, was actually a piece of our used car stock at the time, and it was Victor just grabbed it and said, right, we're going to use that for the film. So off it went to Eon, and then two or three, I think three V8s were acquired in assorted colours and just blown over in Cumberland grey, and had the interiors painted black, and they had all sorts of special effects strapped to them and hurled off ramps and destroyed. I think one exists still as a show car. But yeah, it did some good.
And then, it was the late 80s, was the Ford takeover, and introduction of Virage, which was a pretty new car, really, wasn't it? What difference is made with?
Okay, so Virage was happening before Ford, but it did make it easier. And Ford, when they first bought into Aston Martin, they didn't. They bought a controlling interest, but it wasn't 100%. That came later. The remainder came later, and they left us alone. It was in a way quite surprising, and I think that was because they could see a new model launch and new stuff coming along, and of course, I know it's always been said Aston Martin never made money, but actually, certainly in the sales company, I can tell you, in those 86, 87, 88, 89, we actually made quite a lot of money. But of course, it all went up to Aston Martin and probably helped pay for R&D and everything else. So yeah, Virage was happening before Ford. but it did make it easier financially to do it.
But going into the early 90s, you decided to break off and do your own thing.
Yeah, that's right. So Victor was a great mentor, a good guy to work under, and had a lot of very enjoyable times in his company. And I think probably from a personal point of view, if he hadn't been in Astons throughout the 80s, whether I'd have stayed there or not, I don't know. As I say, he brought a lot of enthusiasm to the business. But yeah, 87, Ford bought an interest, left Aston alone, great. By 91, we're in recession. Suddenly, those people that have ordered Virages are saying, oh, I'm not sure I want to take this car now, you know, life's not the same as it was when I ordered it 2 years ago. That was the waiting list. I can't afford to pay, or whatever, loads of reasons, lots of excuses, lots of people were trying to get out of their commitments. Trying period for me personally, having to go to clients that you would foster good relations with and tell them that actually they can't have their deposit back. And in some cases actually say, well, you know, the car's physical and if you want to pay our loss, you can be out of the contract. So quite difficult at the time. Victor resigned in 1991 and coincidentally there had been a voluntary redundancy program going on that month. And I just thought, having had conversations with Walter Hayes and 1 or 2 other very senior people in Ford Motor Company, that actually I wasn't sure this was going to be the business I wanted to stay in. And so I made the decision to put myself forward for voluntary redundancy, had a short negotiation and left to ponder my future. I wasn't really quite sure what I could do, but I just knew that I knew what I was doing and I wasn't going to be told what I should be doing by the Ford Motor Company. That was, you know, what you do when you're in your 40s.
So sort of 92, you're doing your own thing a bit, but 93 you formed the company and that's when you're in the Muse in London.
Yeah, for 18 months after Aston, I've been what you call a sole trader and dealing, actually, funny enough, with some of Victor's collection. And I got the opportunity to take on a Muse garage in Queensgate Place, Muse, just off Cromwell Road in South Kensington, which was quite famous in the day. There was Dan Margulis and Charles Howard, which then became Gregor Fiskins, Chris Drake, myself, and there had been plenty of businesses in the Muse. It's the widest Muse in London, in probably more than one sense. So yeah, I was able to take on a 9-car showroom there, and
it must have been quite a scene because Alan de Cadney was there, wasn't he, as well?
Yeah, de Cad was on the corner, and you know, South Ken was quite a sort of epicentre for classic cars. You had Coy's up the road, you had Jerry Porter around the corner. As I say, Dan Margulis, Gregor, or Charles Howard, Chris Drake, myself, and so visitors to London with any interest in classic cars made a beeline for South Ken. It was the place to be.
And you were selling classic Astons then, or would you sell a newish V8 as well?
Well, because of the time that I'd had at Astons and staying acquainted with some of the customers that I had then, you know, I was getting V8s and V8 Vantages, DBs, and a variety of cars. But it wasn't always 100% Aston, but it was 90% Aston. And at that time, we didn't have our own workshops, so we used to subcontract all the preparation with Ian Mason, who was at the time West London service agent for Aston Martin. So the arrangement worked quite well. He was just in Shepherd's Bush. We were in South Ken, but you know, there was a moment, particularly at the end of the 90s, when I'd been offered the opportunity to do something with Ian's business, and B, it suddenly dawned on me that the value of what I was doing, apart from making a living to feed my growing family, was actually only as good as your last deal. And that actually having a service side to the business would change that.
So that's how you ended up in Wellesley Avenue, with the servicing there.
Yeah, shortly after ending conversation with Ian Mason about his business, I was offered from a guy actually who you may well know from the racing days, John Goatee. Who was he was in the property business. And John offered us a freehold opportunity in West London for a 30s built, 5,500 square foot drafty old building, which had been a local garage. When it was built in the 30s, it would have been the village garage in far edge of Shepherd's Bush. Pitched roof, office, forecourt, and a couple of pumps. So we took that and decided to, out of South Kent into Shepherd's Bush, devote half the space to sales cars and the other half into servicing. I was very fortunate to recruit a guy called David Swadling, who had been with Ian Mason for many years and was quite well known and very good at what he did, had been preparing race cars and knew his stuff. So he joined, and very shortly that team got up to three or four people. And we were there until, what was it, 2017 we had that place. Although later in life, I think from 2010 onwards, it was entirely service. Service grows, it just
Yes, and then
grows.
you had the premises in Goldhawk Road,
Yeah.
but you had the servicing still in Wellesley Avenue, didn't you?
During that period we had two premises, very close, about a quarter of a mile as the crow flies, and Wellesley became 100% service. I think we ended up with about 7 or 8 ramps in there before we left, and as ever, not enough space. So that precipitated, along with the fact that we'd sold the building and taken a lease back, precipitated a deep think about what we do in the future, because someone said, a client, if you are in the jewellery business and you want to double the size of your business, you buy another safe. If you're in the car business and you want to double the size of yours, you need just space. So that was when we had a deep dive on the future.
And here we are at these fantastic premises in Hertfordshire, which must have been. I remember you coming here, and it was quite a move, which obviously you made a big success of. Must have been quite a decision to do that with Neil and everybody deciding what you're going to do. Yeah.
Well, the alternatives weren't really that exciting, basically. I mean, we had to exit Wellesley Avenue because that was going to disappear from us. People wanting, the new owners wanting ultimately to develop it. Although, interestingly, we've been here 4.5 years and they still haven't got planning permission. But we had to think about what we were going to do if we were going to keep the showroom in Goldhawk Road, which we had made into a quite nice environment for what it was, and maybe take an industrial unit up in Park Royal or something. That would solve the problem in the short term, but it wouldn't give us a lot of parking space. It wouldn't give us all the facilities we have here. And in fact, we really did give it an awful lot of thought, the pros and cons. Having made that decision and right now operated here for 4.5 years, it was categorically the right thing to do for a multitude of reasons, not least London has become anti-car, but also because it's the experience that we can offer clients here is a far more satisfactory one than asking them to come into London and, is it in the charging zone?
Yeah.
What time does the traffic start? What time do I need to get away? And, can I go for a run in this car? Oh yes, it's 20 mile an hour speed limit and speed bumps and Ocado delivery vans and Uber drivers and cameras, and so it's a much better experience from that point of view for us and for our clients.
And the mainline station is only 10 minutes away, and the A1's only 15 minutes away.
Yeah.
And 25 is not very far.
Yeah, well, the M25 is 10 or I think 10 minutes is my best time anyway. But it's the destination. There's nothing else here. There are no fire engines and buses and police cars zooming by every 5 minutes. There's no cameras. There's no 20-mile-an-hour speed limit, speed bumps, etc., etc., etc. So encouraging people to come here. When they get here, it's a nice environment, calm down, have a cup of coffee, have a chat, catch up, do the showroom, do the workshop. A visit is normally 2 to 3 hours and it's relaxed time, whereas in London it's compressed.
And also you have car club meetings here, don't you? You have your own club meeting here, but other clubs come, don't they?
Yeah, we've had Aston Martin Owners Club barbecues here. We've had groups from Piston Heads and Supercar Driver, others. I mean, there has been a massive growth in the last few years with social media of specific clubs who just want to go off and spend a day somewhere. What's the other one? V12 something or another. There's Astons Day. They meet on every 4th Sunday or something at some dealership or whatever. And it's not a great deal of trouble for us to put on, coffees and something to eat and refreshments and show people around. So we really enjoy those events. It's connecting and keeping in touch with people, we're often saying, and I'll step back on this, classic cars. What is that all about? It's not. People that buy a classic car need a reason to use it very often, and whether that's going to Goodwood or whether it's going to Classic Le Mans or Classic Silverstone, or whether it's going to a local meet or Classics on the Common at Harpenden or whatever, it's providing an event that encourages people to get their cars out. So the analogy that I've often used is cars that we have here and we're offering for sale, think of them as chess pieces, and the events we do is we're putting a board out and saying, come and play chess on the board. It's the same thing. So, we enjoy that.
And we've got some exciting things to look forward to next year here. I mean, but sort of going back over the last 30 years, anything you'd have done differently, do you think?
Short of actually attempting to be a prime minister and make the economy. No. I don't think so. Actually, I'm very proud of the business and the people that are in it and what they've contributed to make it what it is today. In particular, Neil. And would I have done anything differently? I'm sure I could think of if I really wanted to. I could think of a few things, but not a lot. I mean, you either grow or you don't. And my attitude has always been, you have to keep moving forward, or you are, by definition, going backwards. And it's the same with difficult times of recession, as we've been through several of those, whether it's 9/11, which kicked everything in the teeth, or any one of a number of these setbacks that we have, Brexit, Ukraine war, call it what you like. You have a moment then when you can either put your head in your hands and cry and it washes over you and can wash you away, or you fight it as hard as you can and push. And part of that will inevitably result in growing the business.
And I suppose a variation of that would be, are there any cars, you speak to anybody who deals in cars, I could have bought something for 5,000, it's now worth 5 million or something. There must have been some cars, some favourite cars you really loved, forget about the value. Give us a couple of examples of cars that you really love to have and love to deal with. There's a bit of value going on there, I'm sure.
Well, of course there is. You're forgetting what I do for a living. But yeah, in fact, recently we sold a DB4 GT for market value. Call it 2.5 million if you like. which is a car that I owned with a friend of mine, sadly no longer active in the motor trade, back in 1993 or no 94 it was actually, and we owned that car for £78,000, and inevitably you're going to be thinking, God, if I kept that. But then there are, you could say that about any number of cars. In fact, we're going to be doing another video in the next few weeks, which will be quite illustrative of this. Any number of cars that you could have bought in the 90s and 2000s and 2010s would have been very good investments. But you can't get,
No.
In what I do, you're either a collector or you're a dealer. And it's quite difficult to be both of those things. So we're dealers. So we have to say, okay, that's worth that today. That's what it's going to go for, and you move on. So there's no point in crying over spilt milk.
So it's looking ahead, and looking ahead next year, you're back at Le Mans, which we've got the famous Club Tête Rouge is coming back. Yeah, well, back again.
As you know, Steve, because you've been.
There's some really funny times.
Yeah, I think it was 25 odd occasions over the years. We've run a programme that we called Club Tête Rouge because it was always based at Tête Rouge, one of the corners at the Le Mans circuit. We ran hospitality programmes for variously anywhere between 28, 30 odd people and 50 people. And that was really born out of when I discovered Le Mans, which was in the late 70s, and went there 4 or 5 times in the 80s. I enjoyed it so much. And you would talk to people in the UK over dinner or whatever, and you talked about Le Mans, and they go, oh yeah, I must go. Oh yeah, well, they'd never been, but knew of it and thought it was a great thing to do. So armed with the inside knowledge of the event and how it works, and given that we had a great location, premises to use, and an infrastructure, a French family that really looked after us and laid on all the catering and the minibuses and got us the tickets, etc., etc., etc. We were able to do these events, which over the years people enjoyed immensely, to the point that actually it ceased towards the end, and we did our last one, I think, in 17. It ceased to be about the motor race and was majoritatively about having a party for 3 days.
We had films, didn't we?
Yeah, we did films. We had a band. We had one year, we had, it's kind of music, we had Not the Rolling Stones, a band.
Oh, that's right.
We opened it out to the Owners Club, and with a special Friday night only ticket, champagne reception, barbecue, live music. And I was very lucky in researching for a band. I came across a website with all these tribute bands, and I just clicked on the button for Not the Rolling Stones. They sounded good. Wrote a mail to them with, I don't know whether you guys would be interested in a small gig in France at Le Mans, mainly male. and this guy replied the next day. He said, "Yeah," he said, "I go every year." Oh. So we got them at a very good figure actually, and they were great. And they brought down inflatable guitars that they were throwing, and we had, I don't know, 250, 300 people on the night. We had Ulrich Betts and Marek Reitman, all senior people from Aston, and David Richards from Aston Martin Racing, and so on. And it was just a hoot, and everyone really enjoyed it. So anyway, these sorts of things we enjoyed. And this year we're going to do it again. We're putting Club Tête Rouge back together. It may not be with the band, but it's an important year, as you know, 100 years. Yeah. And I've been very lucky, certainly, to have gone to 25 of those 100 years of the running of Le Mans. The big
and
event.
Aston Martin will be there, won't they, even as a privateer, I would imagine, with the V8s or V12 Vantages or something?
I really can't say because I don't know, but it is the first sort of year of factory in, with Porsche and Ferrari in the hypercar class. And I know, the Valkyrie, for instance, was always thought of as being for class of racing. I don't think it's going to be, unless there's a private entry. I don't know. Maybe Aston Martin will surprise us, but I'm not sure, because they have their hands full with Formula One.
But it's a fantastic event, and there'll be some fun to be had, I'm sure.
Astonbury for petrol heads is the way to think of Le Mans. And so we are going to be running a programme, and we will be inviting people who want to have a good time and allow us to have a good time at the same time.
And the other good thing, if I can say this, is that for people who haven't been before, it's always nice going with you, because everybody's very good company. You're amongst like-minded people, and also the inside ways of getting into places and what to do and what not to do.
Well,
we meet and have like a crepe at midnight and all that sort of thing, which is good fun.
Crepe Grand Marnier at midnight, which is always traditionally, if it's still there, right next to the champagne tent as well. And that became a meeting point, so we could say to people on Saturday, after the flags dropped and the races started, you're on your own, but if you get lost and you can't find anybody, we will be at the Crepe Grand Marnier midnight. And in fact, it was always amusing going to the man behind the making the crepes and saying, could I have 35 Crepe Grand Marnier? All the other people in the queue were going, what? It was quite amusing.
No,
so
some good fun.
Le Mans is dear to the heart.
The other thing I was going to ask you was, we're leaving market talks for another time, but do you think there's any hidden Astons that might appear next year? There's always, I'm not talking about barn finds, but some cars that have been.
I'm on record. We've had in the last months, two extraordinary cars, and we did a video. And I did start it off actually by saying, I've been in this business for 40 odd years, and it constantly surprises me when a car comes across and onto your radar that you didn't know exist. And one of that particular car, that video is reference to a DB4, which had been Tadek Marrick's own car. Tadek Marrick, the designer of the engine, and it was an extraordinary car because you looked at it and you thought, this is all wrong. Everything was sort of wrong for what it was. But actually, it was Tadek Marrick's car, so it was all right. I never knew that car existed until the owner of it, who had owned it for 28 or 30 years or whatever, was in touch to say, I own this car. And we did all the research and got involved in it. And then we had more recently a car I did know about, but it wasn't necessarily one that I thought would come to us at any point, which was the former prototype and experimental DB5, which ran V8 running gear. So it had the V8 engine and a Dion axle and gearbox. An astonishing car. So these cars do come along, and if I knew what they were before they came along, we wouldn't be having this conversation, because you just don't know. There will be, I'm sure, because apart from anything else, when you do have these types of cars and you do give them the level of exposure and marketing that we do, funny enough, it promotes owners of other similar cars to be in touch and say, well, I've got this, what can you make and do of that? So yes, there will be, but don't ask me what's next.
And as far as the mix in the showroom for the next 12 months will be what you do, a mixture of Gaydon with some DBs and some.
Yeah, we try to. I mean, there are criteria. Quality is the most obvious one, and cars that are actually interesting and not, hopefully, run of the mill. So if you're talking about newer era cars, we like DBSs. They built a smaller number. We like V12 Vantages because they're the kind of like the pinnacle of the Gaydon first gen cars. We like the special editions, whether it's a carbon edition or an ultimate or something that's a bit special. With the V8s, it's difficult these days because you take the market value and you take the cost of full-on restorations, and of course it doesn't pay to do full-on restorations on V8. So we're dealing with a pool of cars that are in various stages of quality, quite a difficult area. And then, of course, in the DB654s, it's perhaps more straightforward because an awful lot of those cars have been restored over the years, and they're in very good shape. And so, yeah, we have and try to keep a broad section of cars, but if we can, and if we could, all of special interest.
Nick, that's been so interesting. Now, we've done 30 years. Fast forwarding 30 years in the future, you'll be here selling hover Aston Martins, spaceships, that sort of thing. But I mean, you know, doing that compressing that, what do you see the sort of future for collecting cars, if you like, collecting Astons? I mean, we've had problems recently with the borders have been more difficult with the paperwork and that sort of thing, the currency, and we've had COVID and all these things that have gone wrong. But you know, the world's still spinning and people still want cars, don't they?
Yeah, I don't detect any lack of appetite for people wanting to enjoy classic cars. And in fact, you know, the growth of events tells that story in itself. Yeah, you know, things have come along to try us. Brexit, you know, caused quite a lot of issues with us really probably losing maybe even up to 20% of our business with people majoritively in Europe who we foster good relationships. The people in Europe now are just not even thinking about buying cars in England because it's aggravation and it's difficult for them, let alone the taxes. But yeah, you know, the future, I don't think that's going to be a problem. There's fuel we talk about. Is it going to be? It's always going to be. I mean, there have been classic cars running. There was one I know this year at Goodwood at the Revival running on sustainable alternative fuels, the Ramco fuels, and in fact the Green P, the famous pre-war Grand Prix Aston, driven by Vettel, at the Silverstone Grand Prix this year, was circulating the circuit on Aramco sustainable whatever fuel. So it's going to be there. It might be expensive, but it's going to be there. But then people aren't doing massive mileages in classic cars. But as far as, you know, here and this business is concerned, I think, you know, we've made the big move over the last few years, and it has been trying with all these things that you just mentioned, making life more difficult for us. But for us now, it's all about consolidating on what we've got. You know, we run an apprenticeship program. We've got a great team of people who do a fantastic job. You know, yeah, it's all about knuckle down, get on with it. And as and when we see opportunities to grow, we'll take them. We've got a great and solid foundation. What the future holds, well, do you know any more than the next person? It's very difficult to determine. It
is very difficult to know. It's particularly interesting you mentioned apprenticeships because that's something that people are interested in. It shows that younger people are interested in being in our business. Yeah, There's clearly money in our business for them and interesting jobs for the future.
You were probably there the other day at RM Sotheby's down at Marlborough House for the auction down there. And there were, I bumped into quite a few associates that I've known for a long time down there, and they were all saying, isn't it great to see so many young people here? And these were young bucks entering the business and establishing themselves. There's no lack of young people coming into this business, and there's no lack of appetite for people to indulge the habit, if you like, of collecting cars, because it is for a lot of people. You know, bringing the skills on to maintain them is a very important part of this business here. Selling cars is one thing, keeping them on the road in a good, reliable condition and improving them as we go along is sometimes more challenging, but it's very worthwhile, and people continue to invest in having cars restored. So I think at this stage, certainly from our point of view, it's just consolidate and watch out for opportunities and take them as they come along.
Fantastic. Well, I've learnt a few things over the last hour or so.
Good.
And I think it's been fantastic, very generous of you to give us your time, Nick.
Well,
and we'll be back in the end of 2023 with our usual panel. And I'm sure there'll be some interesting things to talk about then. But in the meantime, thank you for watching. And thank you very much, Nick, for telling us all your interesting life story, and the story of the company. 30 years
Steve, it's
young,
not all my life, it's just part of my life.
30 years young in 2023. Thank you so much.
Yeah. No, that's been my pleasure, and thank you for taking the time and planting those considered questions at me.
Very good.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.